international issues, and we're really pleased to work along with the IAF to really embrace the global community and come up with solutions to these challenges. So thank you again for being here. Thank you. I hope all of you will participate in some form or fashion in the events of Industry Day, and I'm looking forward to turning over to Michael for our next speakers. Thank you.
So now I'd like to call upon two representatives of Engineers Australia, one very well known to me and one I've recently met, Dr. Kimberly Clayfield, who's chair of the Engineers Australia Space Engineering Committee, and Mr. Greg Parker, who is Divisional Manager for Engineers Australia in Adelaide. And so I'd like to invite you both to come up and say a few words.
Good morning, and thank you for the opportunity to address you today. Is that me? My name is Greg Parker, and I'm the Division Manager for Engineers Australia in South Australia. With me this morning is Dr. Kimberly Clayfield, the CSIRO. Kimberly is the Chair of our National Committee on Space Engineering, and we would also like to acknowledge the current and past National Committee members who have joined us at this breakfast today. Engineers Australia is the peak industry body for engineers in Australia. We are responsible for accrediting engineering qualifications with all of the major universities in the nation. Furthermore, Engineers Australia assesses the capabilities of individuals in determining status as Chartered Professional Engineers, or CPNs as we know. Governments, employers, businesses and indeed consumers carry confidence that when they're dealing with a designated CPN, the highest standards of capability and delivery are applied. So why would Engineers Australia be sponsoring a breakfast event like this associated with International Astronautical Congress? The primary link is engineering, of course, and the continuum of engineering skills applying in the defence industry with those required in the space industry. The defence industry is amongst the largest employers of engineers, not just in Australia, but around the world. And many of the best known defence industry business names in the world are represented in large numbers here in South Australia. Those same business names are often linked to the aerospace industry, evidencing the defence to space links even further, and reinforcing one of the arguments that South Australia is best placed to be the nation's geographic base for Australia's space industry progression. Defence industry skills, inclusive of innovation and technological advancement, are equally applicable to the space industry. And key to that is engineering. It would be narrow of me to present this advancement opportunity just as one of defence. And as Elon Musk, a delegate to this Congress, at least later in the week, once said, engineering is the closest thing to magic that exists in the real world. I think he's right. Communication, innovation and progress in research and development represent opportunities beyond our current collective imagination. Indeed, we already see benefits in things like transport management, smart cities and manufacturing, and in terms of development potential, the life of space-based opportunity remains very young. Australia cannot be left behind in this development. A report called Engineers Make Things Happen, released by Engineers Australia earlier this year, shows a continuing and alarming decline in the number of Australian secondary school students taking on science, technology, engineering and mathematics subjects, STEM subjects. This in turn is leading to a shortage of locally trained engineers and creating challenges in developing an innovative, technology-based economy. However, anecdotal evidence indicates that space is a very effective topic for inspiring and engaging students in STEM. Successful engagement, which encourages the continued pursuit of STEM studies, is critical not only to develop the skill and capabilities needed to grow the Australian space industry, but to underpin the Australian economy as a whole. That's why Engineers Australia calls on governments to work together in forward planning for Australia's role in space, engaging engineers in that planning and employing engineers throughout implementation and delivery. It's pretty obvious I probably wrote that before yesterday's announcement. The primary role of our National Committee on Space Engineering is to support the development of the Australian space industry, particularly through initiatives to develop the future workforce. Our committee is seeking expressions of interest for new members to participate in this exciting stage of the journey. So if you are an Engineers Australia member or you know of such people attending this week, please seek out Kimberley after today's breakfast or through the remainder of the week. We are standing at the threshold of some new opportunity and progress. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Greg. I now have a surprise insertion into the agenda, and I'd like to call upon Mr. Kirk Shireman from NASA to come forward and say, I do not know what.
Good morning. So it's interesting to be up here. Yeah, please. So to be up here at the Space Industry Association of Australia. I work for the government and I'm not Australian. But anyway, it's a pleasure to be here. I have with me a little friend, actually two little friends, and these guys got. I have them here today for a special reason. These were actually awarded last year. Brett Biddington, I think, at Guadalajara, had a drawing of these two exact koalas. And they were awarded to Joel Montalbano here in the back room. And Joel was sitting there with Mary Lynn Dittmar, and they had this crazy idea. Wouldn't it be really cool to fly some koalas in space? And so these guys actually have traveled farther than any koalas in history. I think we have a picture here. If we can get it up, I'll show you. These guys flew up on Space X-10, launched February 20th of this year, landed March 20th this year. They made 480 laps around the Earth, over 10 million miles. And we're here to present them to Michael Davis. So Michael. In making this Congress what it is today. Thank you so much for doing that. I have a montage for you. The reason it's up here on the screen is because the airline decided it would be much better served somewhere else in the world. So your montage, I think, is trying to catch up with the koalas. I'll be a little slower. So we'll endeavor to get you another montage afterwards. But this is what it looks like. And again, thank you very much, and thank you all. I know exactly where this is going to go. Our office, our national office, is hosted by Nova Systems in Adelaide, and Nova has the best collection of space memorabilia I've seen outside the Smithsonian Institute in Washington. And so Pete, where are you, Pete? Pete Nikoloff, his office is decorated with rockets, hardware, software, memorabilia, autographs, and now you have a koala. Thanks, NASA. So, we now come to the launch of our book, Australia in Space, which until yesterday was the absolute up-to-date account of everything that has happened in space for 70 years in Australia. And it gives me a great pleasure to ask the author, Kerry Doherty, whose portrait you see splendidly sitting on the stage here, to come up and say a few words. Kerry.
readjust the mic because I am a little shorter than most of you. Good morning, everyone. And please, Mr. NASA, can I have a koala too? I will sleep much better with a spaceflight koala beside me. But thank you, everyone, for coming this morning. And I'd like to begin by telling you the background to Australia in Space. In 1992, I was working with the Powerhouse Museum in Sydney, and we had noticed very much that there was a real need for a book that told the story of Australian space activities. And how did we notice this? Because I was getting up to 10 calls a day from school students who were studying a curriculum which sadly no longer exists, called Science for Life, and it included a section on Australia in space. There was no textbook, so I was getting calls every day from kids who were trying to do their assignments. And from that grew the seeds of creating a popular space history so that students could use it as a reference and that the general public could actually get an idea of all the things that Australia had been involved with. Because, you know, many people in Australia don't realise how far our history with space activities extends. People know the name of Woomera, but they don't really know what was done there. And, you know, they don't really, or they didn't have very much idea at all of the breadth of activity Australia was involved in and the ways in which we were using space. Even then, space was a critical infrastructure for Australia. So we wrote that book, myself and a co-author, Mr. Matthew James, and it was published by the Powerhouse Museum in December of 1993. It was actually a day that had very bittersweet memories because my father passed away the next day. So the book became very important to me. And for a long time I was hoping that we could have a sequel, you know, an update to cover the ongoing activities in space. However, for many years there weren't enough activities to make it worthwhile producing an update, which was rather disappointing. But at last, in the last few years, of course, we bid for and we won the Congress here. And the Space Industry Association felt that there was now a need for a new edition of Space Australia, which we ultimately now call Australia in Space. But a new book, an updated edition, that looked at a lot of the recent developments in space and would serve also for those of you who were coming to the Congress as a backgrounder and a bit of a souvenir of your time in Australia, to give you some idea of the breadth of our space history. And so Michael very kindly invited me to produce the new edition. And as I had been collecting over these years a great deal of information about Australia's ongoing role and also delving further into its history. And so in fact the new edition begins in the 1870s with Australia's very first rocketeer, a South Australian, as a matter of fact, who invented a new type of rescue rocket for maritime work. And as Michael said, it continues right up until May this year. Of course, now, given the events of yesterday, I hope that I will be allowed to write a new chapter sometime in the next few years. But writing the new edition really helped me to think about and discover even more about the various ways that Australia has been participating in space activities and how much we rely on that infrastructure in orbit that we now call the satellite networks. And I hope that this new book will serve the purpose that the original Space Australia did, of bringing to the public, to school students, as well as to delegates here at this Congress, the breadth and depth of Australian activities and the accomplishments that we have made that we're proud of, but sadly are often not lauded in the media. Of course, we were also had in mind the fact that we didn't have a space agency, and we hope that this would allow the politicians to understand that, you know, Australia is involved in space and that we've had a rather cyclic relationship to space activities, that now is the time to move forward. And the government has heeded that call, And as I said, so now I hope that I'll be able to write a new chapter to the book. Thank you for coming to this breakfast. Thank you again to the Space Association for, the Space Industry Association of Australia for commissioning me to write this new edition. Thank you to Andrew Thomas for very generously providing the foreword. And I'd like to also thank Leo Flander for the portrait that he painted of me. I'm surrounded by space artefacts there because that was done in the space exhibition at the Powerhouse Museum that I used to curate for over 25 years. So thank you again. I hope you will enjoy reading the book. I hope you will buy the book. I'm available for a short period this morning. If you would like to get a copy and have me autograph it, I will be here. Thank you again.
Thank you, Kerry. Before I call upon Andy Thomas to officially launch the book, I'd like our colleagues and partners from ATF Press to perhaps stand up and show us who you are, and in particular the director of ATF Press, Hilary Regan, who it's been a great pleasure to work with on this project, and Liddy Payton, our wonderfully talented graphic designer who made the book look so beautiful, and their other colleagues. So Hilary has a desk in that corner of the room, and Kerry has very kindly offered to autograph any copy that you're interested in buying this morning. Straight at, as soon as the formal proceedings are finished, Hilary will be there. So we really encourage you to buy a copy of the book as a memento with a $10 discount for IAC delegates today. So with that, it gives me, I also shall do one other thing, and that is acknowledge the presence of Dr. Paul Scully-Power, who was the author of the foreword of the first edition. It's great to have you with us, Paul, and I know that you've come over from Sydney especially for this and the dinner last night, so please thank Paul. And I'd now like to introduce our good friend and colleague, Dr. Andrew Thomas, to officially launch the book.
As many of you as visitors have probably come to realise, we in South Australia are very proud of some things that took place here in the early days of the space program, and that history is captured very well in this book. I remember when I was very young, 4 years ago that I care to mention, we would hear these stories about this strange far-off land to the north called Woomera, where they were, in our minds, doing amazing things, searching out new planets, boldly going and so on. Of course, the fantasy wasn't quite what was the reality, but it really fueled the imagination for people such as myself as kids. And I suspect many of you may not be aware of all the contributions that Australia made to the early days of space flight and satellite technology. And you tend to think just of rockets and launching rockets, but there's a lot of other activities in the space sector that have gone on in Australia. Did you know, for example, that one of the first anti-G suits was built here in Australia? An anti-G suit is a suit that you wear when you're flying in high acceleration modes to keeps the blood confined in the upper body so you don't pass out. And the basic capability to do that was actually generated first here in Australia. You might also be interested to know that the first words from the moon, which were not one small step for man, it was contact, came through Australian tracking stations. And indeed, the Australian tracking station network has been pivotal for big deep space missions, flagship missions like the Galileo probe that went to Jupiter, and most recently the Cassini probe that got those spectacular images back from Saturn. And of course, you've probably heard and talked about the launch of a satellite from Australia 50 years ago in 1967. That was actually a pretty remarkable undertaking when you think that it was just 10 years after Sputnik. Satellites would be launched right here in this state. So now we have this publication with an up-to-date summary of all that history, and I urge you to get a copy and look at it. And I hope with the announcement that we're going to now finally, at last, have a space agency, it won't take 20 more years for an updated version of the book to come out, but that there will be a need to update it much sooner than that. So with that, I would like to say thank you, and thank you all for coming, and consider this book officially launched.
Thank you, Andy. I have to convey an apology from Dr. Jean-Yves Le Gaulle, who had planned to be here, but he managed to find himself in a conflict of invitations, so he sends his apologies and his best wishes. So that concludes the formal part of today. Thank you so much for getting up so early and being here to help us celebrate all of these things. Mary Snitch has asked me to remind you that there is a full day's program of Industry Day activities today, starting very soon. 2 plenaries and lots of other events, a lunch that many of you have been invited to, which will be addressed by the Acting Minister for Industry and Science, Michaelia Cash. So we'll probably find out a little bit more about the government's plans at lunchtime. And so please participate in everything you can today. Enjoy Industry Day. And finally, thank you to our Acting Executive Officer, Leslie Grady, and her partner, Terry Clark, for helping us plan this event today and for getting up even earlier than the rest of us to make sure that the tables are all set out and the slides, etc., etc. So it's been great fun, and thank you for coming.
This is not a surprise inclusion. I think I'm not alone in disagreeing with something that Michael said earlier, where he implied that he was just sitting in the chair at the right time. The success of the SIA at the moment, the success of this event, and the shepherding of a space agency are largely down to his work. So I think credit where credit's due. Please congratulate.